quiet on the set.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Reference Point. I'm your host, Dave Cookerhook. And this evening, we have a very special guest who's joining us from Southern California. It's David Simon, who's an attorney and an author. And David has written a book called Meatonomics, hope you can see that, which is a book about the agriculture industry, okay, specifically as it pertains to the farming of animals for food and usage like that. So, David, welcome to Reference Point. I appreciate your being here. Your book is fascinating. What brought you to writing this book?
Well, hi, David. Thanks for having me. As a lawyer, I've been interested in some of the issues affecting animal agriculture for a long time. And 7 or 8 years ago, I sent a video to a friend of mine who was a dean at a major law school. The video showed imagery in factory farms, and it was, in some cases, disturbing, and I was interested what he thought about it. His response was that while it was disturbing, he thought it was illegal, which meant that it was largely an anomaly, and it wasn't really representative of the way the factory farming industry worked, which seemed to make sense to me at the time until I started to dig a little deeper, and I found that, in fact, it is generally legal to treat animals in factory farms largely with impunity. They can be treated in ways that would shock us if you saw it done to a dog or a cat, and that's largely because of something called customary farming exemptions. These are laws that exempt factory farms from anti-cruelty protections. As I started to dig into some of these laws, I found that there are many others like that, and that these laws provide a valuable economic benefit to the agriculture industry because it allows them to produce their goods more inexpensively, and it allows them to offload their costs onto society.
So is factory farming, when it comes to animal agriculture, a relatively new phenomenon, or has that been like forever?
No, factory farming is relatively new. Agriculture has been around for as long as humans have been civilized, 10,000 years or more. But factory farming is new within the past 3 or 4 decades, and it's really become the dominant method of animal food production in industrial society.
So agriculture is regulated by a couple of government agencies, right? And isn't it like, is it the USDA or how does that all play out, actually? Because if there are things like you're talking about are going on, you would think the government would not be particularly favorably inclined toward that sort of behavior.
You would think. Animal agriculture is regulated at many levels, both the federal and state level. At the federal level, it's generally the U.S. Department of Agriculture, or the USDA, and the Department of Health and Human Services, or HHS. Within HHS, we have the FDA, and often the USDA and the FDA split responsibility for regulating animal food production in ways that we would consider absurd if they hadn't been going on for decades, and now we just take them for granted. For example, the FDA regulates seafood, the USDA regulates meat and poultry. The FDA regulates meat if it's only 3% or less of the ingredients in a particular item, which leads to these bizarre results like the USDA might regulate sausage, but the FDA might regulate sausage pizza. So we get all kinds of
odd, I mean, that's like bizarre.
Anomalies.
That would seem to create a tremendous amount of confusion and conflict even within the industry, within the agriculture industry itself.
Yes, it does. It's not a great situation, and it can result in problems in food safety. For example, where in one instance the USDA, which regulates the labeling of eggs, and the FDA, which regulates the safety of egg production, didn't connect on a particular shipment of eggs, and something like 300 million eggs were recalled because they contained salmonella, which wasn't reflected in the safety analysis, and it wasn't an issue with the labeling. So neither one of them caught it.
Wow. Well, that's some. That in and of itself seems like a silly way to try to do business. And it also seems to set up some of these conflicting responsibilities like you just talked about. Now, your book talked about a number of things that I found very fascinating, where one industry, like the USDA, which is supposed to be responsible for identifying what is a healthy diet for Americans, and yet they have these other activities that they are doing for the purpose of supporting the increased activity and revenue within the agricultural community. And you used a term in your book called a checkoff program, which I thought was very interesting. What exactly is a checkoff program, and how does it fit into this agency regulatory thing?
So a checkoff program got its name from a time when producers would check a box to indicate a voluntary participation in this program. It's not voluntary anymore, it's mandatory, it's like a tax. Checkoffs are created by Congress in order to allow for a particular industry to collect essentially a tax on production of its goods and then use those proceeds for marketing purposes. So for example, if you've ever seen or heard a slogan like, beef, it's what's for dinner, milk, life, pork, the other white meat, the incredible edible egg. These are slogans of checkoff programs for the big pork, milk, and egg industries, which are created by imposing a small, at the point of sale, tax on these items, collecting those funds, and then spending them. And the returns on those expenditures are quite significant, typically averaging about 8 to 1. So if the beef industry spends about $100 promoting its product through checkoffs, it's likely to see $800 in increased sales.
Ooh, 8 to 1, that's pretty good. So this takes us into some of the economics, and look at the title of your book, Meatonomics. It sounds like it's all about it ties into the money side of this whole situation, and this is one example that you just mentioned with the checkoff programs.
Yeah, and there's another important feature of checkoff programs, and that, which you alluded to at the beginning, is that the USDA, or the federal government, is behind them.
Right.
The USDA monitors the collection of funds, it monitors the spending of funds, it often has a veto right over how ads are formulated and the actual text and content of advertising. It can be involved in appointing the personnel to a checkoff program. As a result, the US Supreme Court has ruled that when a checkoff program speaks its message, beef, it's what's for dinner, or milk, life, or whatever the message, that is the federal government speaking. The court has said that is government speech.
Wait a minute. So what you're saying is the ads that we see on TV and here and on the radio and whatever that are promoting, the stuffed crust pizza are government speak?
Government speech, yes, as a matter of law, as articulated by the highest court in the United States, those ads are government speech. That is literally the United States federal government telling you to eat more beef, pork, eggs, or dairy.
Okay. And you can't tell them not to do that because, okay. So let's roll this back to the next question. Okay, if they're doing that, why is that a problem? Why is that a bad thing?
Well, for a few reasons. First of all, Aldous Huxley wrote this book, Brave New World, published in the 1930s, in which he described almost this exact scenario. He described sort of a dystopian future where the government exists for one purpose, and that's to get consumers to buy more goods. And people who read that book sort of look at that as not a great thing. it's Big Brother-ish. It's manipulative.
Right.
We don't want our government to manipulate our consumer buying practices in that way. And there's this other piece of the equation, which is that we know from the overwhelming body of published peer-reviewed clinical research that animal foods, particularly in the quantities that Americans consume them, are bad for our health. They contribute to cancer, diabetes, and heart disease, among other diseases. The USDA and the Department of Health and Human Services are also aware of this, and in their other roles, they inform us of the dangers of excessive consumption of animal food. So then the question is, if these agencies are aware of these health problems, and it's in fact their duty to advise us of these health problems, then why is the USDA out of the other side of its mouth telling us to consume more of these very goods that it says are bad for us? That is the problem. That is a major conflict in this agency.
I think you mentioned in your book that when you look at that conflict, that bifurcation of the two areas of responsibility, the one that has the most funding and that it gets the most attention and whatnot is the one that's doing the checkoff programs and those other things to increase consumption, as opposed to the side that is trying to provide a level of awareness and understanding about what is a healthy diet. Which seems to me to be a little bit kind of like, yeah, that's not, that's crazy. That's crazy.
That's right. Well, and just to put that in context, the animal food industry, which has checkoffs for about a half a dozen foods, typically spends about $600 million in a given year on these checkoff programs. And then the fruit and vegetable industries, they do have some checkoffs for things like avocados, blueberries, mangoes, they spend typically 1/10 of that.
Oh, wow.
So you can see that there is a gross distortion in the amount of marketing spending to get Americans to buy animal foods.
And if they're getting an 8-to-1 return, then it makes a lot of sense that they're going to spend that kind of money. Wow.
That's right.
Wow.
A massive return.
So one of the things that when we talk about this, though, it's like, and this goes back to the money side of what goes on based on your book, where you talked, David, about something that are called externalized costs, which was a term that I was totally unfamiliar with until I read your book. But it's a significant part of what the impact is for the animal agriculture industry. So could you explain what an externalized cost is?
Certainly. It sounds complicated, but it's actually quite simple. An externalized cost is just a cost that two parties to a transaction impose on somebody else instead of incurring themselves. So for example, if I take my garbage and take it down to the end of my driveway and put it in a can for the garbage service to pick up, and I pay them to pick it up, I internalize my garbage collection costs. On the other hand, if I take my garbage and drive out to the park and throw it in the park, I've externalized my garbage collection costs because I've required society to bear those costs. And in my book, I look at the way that the animal food industry is essentially dumping its garbage in our parks by externalizing the vast majority of its production costs and imposing those costs on consumers and taxpayers.
And how do they do that?
Well, among other things, and primarily by passing these laws that we discussed at the outset, of which there are literally hundreds. These are laws that serve to insulate the industry from lawsuits, from criticism, from regulatory activity, and that allow them to externalize their costs on society with impunity. For example, take something called a right to farm law. These are laws that we have in all 50 states in this country, and they say that if a factory farm is doing business wherever that may be, even if it's in a residential community, the residents in that community have no right to sue that facility for torts like nuisance. So for example, if you've got a hog production facility a half a mile away and the creek that runs through your property is polluted, or your air is polluted, or your home value declines, and all of these are regular features of life near a factory farm, you have no right of action against that farm. So this is literally a way that a factory farm imposes its cost of production on the rest of us by seeking protection from the legislature, getting a law passed, and then going out and polluting with impunity.
So let me kind of give that back the way I'm interpreting that. So it's sort of saying that if there are, there's waste material as associated with the production of anything. Okay, in this case, it's a farm, and in most industries and manufacturing, I've got a background in manufacturing. In manufacturing, you have to dispose of those things, and it costs you money. Somebody has to come and pick them up and take them away, or you have to recycle them, or whatever you're going to do. What I'm hearing you say is that anything that's associated with the byproduct of whatever they're doing that normally would need to be disposed of by a third party, they don't have to deal with that, or at least they don't have to pay for that, even if they do deal with it.
Well, let me put a finer point on that. The factory farms are subject to regulation at the state and federal level, and they are required to dispose of their waste in a manner that's compliant with the regulatory scheme.
Okay.
However, as a matter of tort law, typically, if your house is near another piece of real property and there are nuisance features associated with that other piece of property, whether it's high levels of noise, dangerous activities, the emission of pollutants, you typically have a right of action under a tort known as nuisance in the real property category. These right to farm laws eliminate that tort right of action. So they essentially say, we're sorry your house declined in value by $500,000 because we came and did business half a mile away from you. Unfortunately, you've got no right of action. You can't make us stop, and you can't make us pay you anything to keep doing what we're doing.
Okay, got it. So when you take a look at the economic impact in your book, you are taking the externalized cost, the things that they would have to pay for if they were operating like a normal business, and calculating some of that into the cost of activity associated with factory farming. What are we looking at in the way of numbers here? I mean, there's a lot of money that's spent in buying food, right? Meat and produce and eggs and milk and stuff like that. But what are we talking about? What kind of money are we discussing here?
Well, we're talking about large figures. For example, the total sum of all externalized costs for this industry just in the United States, as I calculated, is about $414 billion with a B, which is just a staggering number. It's larger than the gross domestic product of many countries. It's half of what we spend on Medicare in this country each year. It's a significant enough figure that it distorts the way that Americans buy food. It distorts the way we consume. It affects our health. It affects us in many ways that we're not even aware of.
And that $414 billion, that's an annual number?
That's an annual number, correct.
Okay. That's a big number.
That's a big number.
Now, in your book, one of the things that I thought was real interesting about your book is you address this topic from different facets. One is the economic impact. And we're talking about the economic impact right now. So this $414 billion, and some of which is the externalized costs, et cetera. What is the financial impact then on the country? I mean, how does that have I think people need to understand how that has a negative impact on things.
Yeah, that's a great question. So in economics, there's a very simple principle known as the law of demand. And the law of demand says that when prices go up, demand or consumption comes down. And conversely, when prices go down, consumption goes up. And we all obey the law of demand. If you've ever bought anything on sale, you've participated because you saw that the price was low, you decided to make a decision to consume.
Right.
What we see in this country is that because of this huge level of externalized costs of animal foods, the actual retail prices that we see when we go to a grocery store or a restaurant are much, much lower than the actual societal cost of one of these goods. For example, if you were to take the externalized costs of animal foods and add them to the retail prices of animal foods, you would find that the cost that we really should be paying for these goods is almost 3 times higher than it is. A $5 Big Mac, for example, would actually cost $13.
Oh.
A $10 slab of baby back ribs would cost $26. What that means is that if you apply the law of demand, prices are artificially low, and that is causing consumers to buy these goods at artificially high levels. In other words, prices are so low, instead of $13 for a hamburger, you can buy it for $5. That makes us buy that many more hamburgers. That leads to incredibly high levels of consumption of animal foods in this country, something like 200 pounds per person per year, which puts us in the very highest levels around the world on a per capita basis, and leads to these very high levels of disease. Again, cancer, diabetes, and heart disease being the 3 biggest.
Right. I'm going to want to talk about the health implications in a little bit, but I want to just finish up on this topic of the monetary impact. So I get the idea of demand and supply, and the if you artificially. So what we're seeing, I'm from what the book and what you were just saying is that because the prices are artificially low. Let me rephrase that. If the industry was operating with normal business practices and having to handle the various costs that were appropriate for whatever that industry is, then you're saying that the prices that they would have to charge for their product as it goes into market would be significantly higher than it is. And because it's not that, they are artificially low, which gives people the intent, well, hey, I mean, it's cheaper to go and pick up, dinner at McDonald's or Burger King or Kentucky Fried Chicken than it is to, go and, do something and make my own dinner at home using fruits and vegetables or even lean meat or whatever. That's what I'm hearing you say. Is that?
Yeah, that's exactly the case. If prices were, if the industry was forced to incur these costs itself instead of imposing them on society, prices would rise to their natural level, and people would be consuming much, much less of these goods.
Are we seeing that type of situation where the balance in other countries, is it more in balance in other parts of the world?
I'm mainly familiar with the American market, but I can tell you that I've spoken in both Canada and Australia, and in both of those countries they have checkoff programs just as we do, and in both of those countries they have high levels of externalized costs and high levels of consumption. So that I can say that in the industrialized world as we know it, we're seeing similar issues. Now in third world countries where disposable income is just much lower, we see much lower levels of consumption of animal foods. And by the way, people there tend to have much lower levels of these diseases that are associated with animal food consumption, like cancer.
Interesting. Okay, I think we've got, 3 minutes or so left in our show right now, and I appreciate the fact that, because we talked about this earlier, that you were going to stick around so we could do a second take on this, and I want to do that. I want to let the folks who are watching know that if they have any questions about what David and I are talking about, send those queries into info@referencepointtv.com, and we'll get those questions answered. And definitely, Meatonomics, it's a heck of a book. So the last thing before we have to sign off for now, David, is I just want to go back to this thing about the conflict between in the USDA between what they're trying to do to promote healthy eating versus the checkoff programs. Did this just sort of, how did that come about? I mean, was that sort of something that evolved by cause of lobbying? Did somebody wake up one morning, or has it always been that way?
No, it sort of evolved. Abraham Lincoln created the USDA, and 150 years ago, it was intended to prop up and support the agriculture industry, and that was its main function, to provide support for farmers in rural America. And over time, it evolved this second role of advising Americans on what they should be eating. Now, the USDA and the Department of Health and Human Services together, each 5 or 6 years, release what they call dietary guidelines for Americans, in which they tell us what we should be eating. Many commentators think USDA should not be involved in that process at all. Let the Department of Health and Human Services do it. This is a department that is designed and focused on advising people how to be healthy. USDA doesn't really have that mission, yet USDA insists on being involved, and cynics say it's because they want to make sure that health recommendations allow them to continue to sell
the stuff that's
products.
bad for us, yeah.
Right.
But that's interesting. I hadn't realized the history of that from the USDA perspective, and that makes sense. You know, if the role is to assist in that, activity to get to support the farming community, then great. But the Department of Health and Human Services has a different mission, and they ought to separate those missions, and maybe we can do something about that. Well, I think we've reached the end of our first 30-minute discussion. I appreciate your being here, Dave. Thank you so much. And we'll come back after a few minutes, and ladies and gentlemen, we'll see you next time here at Reference Point.